Doing research is questioning and disagreeing. I'm Mayla Boguslav, and I study research. I ask questions such as, what is research? How do we measure its success? I live by the motto, ignorance is bliss, because when you don't know something, it's an opportunity to learn. Researchers live in the ignorance or the unknowns. They ask questions, identify areas of ignorance, lead the way to gain knowledge, and most importantly, ask the next questions about our new ignorances. Welcome to the Ignorance Podcast, where we learn about research through research questions. Let's welcome our guest scientist for today. Please introduce yourself by name only and your favorite thing to do outside of work.
My name is Larry Hunter. I have lots of favorite things I like to do outside of work, but I swim in the ocean every day, and that's definitely one of them.
Nice, thanks. Now that we know that you're kind of a human person, not just this amorphous scientist, let's get down to some more questions. What questions excite you in your work? What questions are you currently pursuing?
Well, I'm lucky that I'm getting to start on a new project that's an ambitious one. It's really about a question I've been curious about for decades. The question is, where do our desires come from? Where do our wants, our wishes, our fears? And our desires are not the same as the desires of a bug or a bacterium. But I think bugs and bacteria do want things. And so, how does that work? And are there other kinds of things in the universe that might want something? What would that mean? What's the physics, if you will, of wanting something? And then you could also look at it from sort of an AI perspective. Is it possible for an artificial intelligence thing to want anything? What would that mean? And then there's the sort of more personal growth psychology piece of it. What do I want out of life? What would really make me happy? What should I be doing? What do I wish I wanted? Or, gee, I wish I didn't want that. How do human beings come to want what they want? And how does it change through our lives? And how do we get new ones and lose old ones? And so there's a lot of angles to this question.
Yeah, and I would love to know some of those answers, right? From my own perspective of how do I know what I want, right? Even just personally, I think it'd be interesting to answer that for myself too, and maybe even for yourself also. And I think it has huge impacts, as you're exactly saying, right, on many, many different fields, which is really, really cool. My next question for you is, how do you hope to impact the world? So that's kind of a nice segue, that this has a lot of impact. And so how do you
Well,
hope to do
look,
that?
one of the problems with science is until you figure out, discover or invent what you intend to, then it's a little hard to know what the impact or consequences are going to be. And sometimes they surprise us. But I think there's a bunch of places where you could imagine if we had some answers to those questions. So maybe we could build something that actually wanted an artificial intelligence that had its own desires and fears or whatever. Maybe we could build physical systems. Active droplets is a thing that physicists and material scientists are really interested in right now. How could we make a thermodynamic system out of parts that we understand that wanted something, that acted like it cared about something? And we could also, go down the personal growth path. We're social creatures. We live in a social system where there's status, and we look to people with high status about what we should want. And we also want to climb up that status hierarchy. Um, we want love. We want all kinds of things that come from others. And so some of our desires are socially transmitted, like our other ideas. And so understanding that better might help us be happier human beings. But the implications of answering these questions are not always positive. It might also risk, better kinds of disinformation and, more convincing advertising. So the implications are vast as are the questions. But for a lot of basic science, I think it's important, and this is a very basic science question, I think, not to be too driven by the potential impacts.
That's interesting, right? This idea of impact in general, that you answered it very specific to kind of your questions and your research direction. It could also be answered in relation to you as a person, right? So just to call that out. And also, I definitely implanted in your brain the desire to want to do my podcast. So it's already
Right.
there, right?
We
Just to
do
be
that
very
to each
clear.
other all the time, all the
Yeah,
time.
exactly. So I just wanted to call that out as a really fun example. And I think it's really important that we both think long term and short term, right? And this idea of application is a really interesting question that is definitely still talked about right now around research of how, what should we be funding, right? Basic science, applied science, and all these different pieces. So really, really apt question to bring up for sure.
I'd like to talk about that a little bit because one of the reasons I feel so lucky, how does this question impact my own personal life? This is the culmination of my entire career in some ways. So I started off, in graduate school when I was a baby scientist, worrying about the implications of the questions. I was interested in goals for knowledge, and how do we come to have particular desires. And I've advanced to the point where now I'm a tenured full professor. And I recently changed institutions and was handed a pretty good startup package to advance my research. And so I am in an incredibly lucky position that very few scientists ever get to, which is I have a fair amount of money to go study whatever the heck I want. I feel so much right now that this is my moment, and I really want to take full advantage of it and make the best progress I can with this opportunity.
The goal is really about the question, right? Making progress in those questions and starting to answer them for some impact in some way, whatever that may potentially be, whether it's on you, the world, different things.
The main impact, if you will, that I'm after is understanding how it is that things can matter to us. Is one of the most fundamental questions in the universe. It's right up there with the origin of life and the nature of the universe. I mean, it's a really fundamental question, especially about human beings.
Who has influenced you? Who are people you look up to?
That's a hard question. It's a huge list. There is a ton of work from scientists in many areas that are relevant to this. I've been reading, statistical mechanics to try to understand people who have quantitative theories of semantics of how something can matter to a physical system. So Dave Wolpert and Artemy Kolchinsky wrote this paper in the statistical mechanics that I'm particularly enamored of, and really changed the way I thought about the world. And Lisa Barrett Feldman at the other end of the spectrum is one of the first people to really pursue what is now being called affective science, looking at emotions with a scientific perspective. And her contributions, there are many, that are really about the role of interoception of our own nervous system's perception of what's going on inside us. And that gets character labeled culturally with words and characterized as emotions. There's something about knowing about how we are doing ourselves, our bodies, that it plays a critical role in what we want. If I can't breathe, there's a signal in my body that makes me very desperately want to breathe, and that's kind of an obvious one. But uh, I think Barrett Feldman's characterizations of how emotions work, or a good intro to that is her book How Emotions Are Made. So, Barrett Feldman would say, the classic story is, you get afraid and therefore you get goosebumps and sweat or whatever. And she would turn that around and say, you get goosebumps and sweat, and then your brain says, oh, I'm afraid. That interoception is a huge through line, and her work, and now there's a lot of work. NIH is having an interoception workshop. It's a hot new topic in neuroscience. So there's a whole bunch of neuroscientists who are doing this, who are really important inspirations. Um, and I would be remiss to not mention my mother in this collection of people. So my mother was always about do what feels right to you, and she's been gone for many decades, but I still have her in my head as one of the things that caused me to desire or look askance at some of my desires or whatever. There's this funny meta thing that goes on, but and she would love this. The voice in my head of my mother says, "Larry, you are doing the right thing." And my partner really drove me to this in a way because I was having a bit of I'd like to call it a midlife crisis, but that makes me younger than I actually am, or I'm going to have to live to very old, worried about what I was going to do next. And She was like, forget all the noise, just think about what is it that you really want, right? And I really sat with it for a while, and I tried to figure out, okay, I have so much life left. What is it that really does matter to me? And so it kind of really, with her help, got me here.
Yeah, it reminds me similar of like how I kind of moved through my career in different ways, as you know. And I realized that I kind of study what I don't love or what makes me uncomfortable. So I studied the unknowns, right? Being the unknowns that made me uncomfortable. And your unknown in this case was, what do I want to do next, right? What's my desire? And so, as you said, like on the meta level, it's very cool that we're kind of studying these things that also both help us, right? Have this impact on us and hopefully also impact on other things, right? By being understanding or other pieces that you've already mentioned. Something that also can drive us is success. And so, a question I would love to ask you is, how do you know if you've been successful at your work and as a scientist? What is your evaluation criteria?
Oh, wow. Great question. Different evaluations for different kinds of science. So, one of the really hardest things about pursuing this question around, how things can come to matter is trying to figure out empirical tests of theories. How can we actually get some evidence that would say yay or nay? Because it's really easy to do armchair theorizing. I should be careful here. It is important and possible to do good psychology. All right. I don't want to call into question the way we study people by studying their behaviors and reaction times and the content of their utterances. And there's lots of good science that can be done that way. But for this particular question, I think that's going to be hard. I think that question isn't separate from doing the science, it's part of doing the science. How it is that you're going to figure out whether Larry's crazy pet theory really has some evidence to support it. And there's a lot of different angles you have to come at an empirical question in order to be able to really demonstrate it, right? So we have our gold standards. Before I'm going to be allowed to market a drug that I'm going to claim is going to cure you of something, where you have to run it through a clinical trial. And that's a very high standard. And, for a lot of theories, particularly psychological theories, it's very difficult to have a reasonable double-blind, placebo-controlled kind of clinical trial. Not available to us. So what else can we do? We have to come at it from multiple different angles and evaluate different ways. And hopefully, by evaluating enough different ways that are okay, we gain confidence in the claims. But being creative about how to evaluate them is an important part of being a scientist.
Yeah, so it's hard to answer, right? I kind of asked this question intentionally because, as you alluded to, it's really a part of the question, right? That whenever we ask a question, we need to also think about how do we know we've been successful at that question. And part of the way that I'm doing this, right, and studying scientists is getting to talk to them and see kind of how they answer these questions and how they go through themselves and think through these questions that I think really showcase what science really is about, right? Thinking about these types of things, whether that's the question, whether that's the evaluation, all the different people that we're impacting on all those different pieces. So, what has been your most surprising result?
Yikes. Well, so I don't have a ton of results. I'm relatively new at this particular question. I think the thing that surprised me the most is this interoception through line that I mentioned to you. That this the physics version of how a thermodynamic far from equilibrium system can want something. It depends on the equations. Depend on a viability function. What's the probability that this system will continue in a low entropy state and will not dissolve? For people who aren't statistical physicists, the low entropy state is organized and functioning. And continuing in that state means continuing to exist, basically, as opposed to turning into gray goo. And so even the physical system has a representation of the viability of that physical system. The theories of human emotions have interoception, and our body's sensation of itself is plays a critical role in how it prioritizes the things it wants or doesn't want. That sensation of your internal state um, is fundamental to caring or anything mattering to you at all, and ultimately to your most sophisticated, wishes and fantasies and desires. I think it was a really surprising thing to me.
Yeah, and I love this question because I think something that scientists also look for are those surprises, right? We want to find the things that we may not have expected, and that tends to actually drive us to continue to ask these questions and continue to do that work. So I hope you continue to find some surprising results that leads you to kind of new angles that allows you to kind of continue and build out this work further.
Before you get to your next question, I want to comment on that. So I do think that surprise is a really strong indicator that you've discovered something, even if other people knew it first. But I don't think surprise is the only way that new questions come. Sometimes answering one question actually opens the door to another one. And there's another scientist who's influential much more in my early career, a guy named Ashwin, who I went to grad school with, and we taught each other all kinds of things, and including how to cook each other's cultural cuisines and stuff. It was hilarious. But one of the things that his science did, and this is early AI a long time ago, was look at natural language understanding as a kind of question transformation. So you come in with a set of questions, and then you process the text, and the result isn't necessarily answers so much as new questions. And so I've had that model in my head of how scientists work is as I make progress on understanding things, even if it's not terribly surprising, that progress almost always raises new questions. So often about how to evaluate it or what it would mean if I translated that into this other area, right? If I understood something about interoception and metabolism bacteria, does that mean anything about human feelings? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I agree with you. Surprise is not the only way, it is one way. And kind of my next question actually is that some other ways that this can happen too. So my next question is, what is your favorite disagreement? Because just as surprises, disagreements can also lead us to ask new questions and come up with new theories and new paradigms to think about as well.
Yeah, that's funny. So I find myself, I'd like to learn from people disagreeing with me, but I haven't made enough progress in this particular research yet to get very many people to engage with me, let alone disagree with me in any interesting way. I do have disagreements with people in the field, and that sharpens some of my thinking about things. So, for example, a really important piece of artificial intelligence is reinforcement learning. And reinforcement learning is entirely driven by reward. And my argument with that is not against reward, but how that is ducking the question. All right. It's not answering which rewards and where did they come from? They're always exogenous. They're always comes from outside the system. So reinforcement learning requires, a set of actions that you could take and a reward function and a set of senses that you have to say what the state of the world is with respect to your actions and your rewards. But making the reward function outside of the theory to me begs the important question of where did those desires come from and how are they dynamic, right? A reward function is a fixed thing. And so one of the things that's obvious if you start thinking about this even a little bit is our desires and the things that matter to us, what we care about changes over time. So we can't just imagine there's this fixed reward function out there. We're sort of discovering what to want.
Yeah, a book that reminds me of is The Neuroscience of You, I think Chantel Prat, where I was curious on the updated neuroscience, right? That a lot of our AI comes from neural theory. She also specifically talks about reward systems. And it is really interesting thinking about AI versus the human, right? That the human can update them through these desires. And how do we potentially, if we want to continue to create AI that has more desires and does the things we potentially desire, right, more, how do we kind of change that reinforcement learning and that reward system and make it dynamic as exactly you're thinking. And so these are questions I've been thinking about actually a lot too around how do we influence each other around collaborations in science and all these different aspects that kind of exactly you're asking too, which is fun. If you could do anything, not limited by grants or other factors in your space, what would you be doing? What is your vision for the world?
I am one of the luckiest scientists I know. Okay, I have that, and you're right. What I've been telling you for the last half hour is exactly what I would do if I could do anything I wanted, and I didn't have to worry about getting promoted or tenure, and I didn't have to worry about bringing in money for it. I didn't have to worry about anything. I just had the opportunity to pursue that question, and this is the question I picked.
Yeah, it's great. That kind of ends the time. And so I'd love for you to reintroduce yourself in an introduction, giving us your job title in the field and anything else you'd like to say.
My name is Larry Hunter, and I was recently appointed a professor of pediatrics at the University of Chicago. But there's a section in pediatrics on biomedical informatics, and that's really what I've been doing in a lot of my career, has been worrying about how to apply computational tools to advance human health and thriving. A lot of my career has been around trying to find artificial intelligence approaches to those questions, particularly around hypothesizing mechanisms of action. My original training was in computer science. So I got a PhD in artificial intelligence in 1988, 89, which is right when there was a big AI bust. We called it AI winter in those days. And so my newly minted degree was really useless. And so I ended up turning to NIH, the National Institutes of Health, where the Human Genome Project was just getting off the ground. And so I started something called the Machine Learning Project at the National Library of Medicine. And that launched me down this path into biomedical applications. But I've always been interested in sort of fundamental theories and methods for AI. And so this is, in a way, this question about desires and mattering and so forth is getting back to all of our work. So, some early work I did with Ashwin resulted in a book called Goal Driven Learning. Very good example of what we were about. Now I want to know where the goals come from. How did those happen?
Thank you for talking to us about your questions. And I'll also just add to your introduction that Larry is my thesis advisor for my PhD. And a lot of these things really allowed me to explore my questions that I wanted to, right? Which was about the questions. Where do the questions come from that we ask? And how do we find good questions and ask good questions? And how do we connect questions at large? So this podcast really is also influenced by a lot of that. So I'll say thank you, Larry, for all of those influences as well. And thank you for agreeing to do my podcast and get interviewed today. I really appreciate it.
It's been a real pleasure, both doing the podcast and seeing the amazing work that you've done in looking at the questions scientists ask.
My biggest takeaway from this episode is that we all have different goals and desires and are influenced by the many things surrounding us. For Larry, this is a personal question as well as a fundamental question with many potential impacts. What are your desires? Where do you think they come from? To learn more about Larry Hunter and any cited or named people, please take a look at the episode description. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Ignorance Podcast. Please follow the Ignorance Podcast wherever you get your podcasts to learn more about science through research questions.